I want to thank the Foothills Council of World Affairs for having me and for a lovely introduction. I started studying terrorism well before it became sort of trendy and in vogue. And I can tell you that at Georgetown, when I was doing my master's degree, I was a teaching assistant, and we taught a course in the Foreign Studies program on terrorism, and there was about 10 students. And, you know, people weren't really that interested. I can tell you now that those courses fill up a little bit more quickly. But before 9/11, there were maybe only about 25 or 30 terrorism experts. On the 12th of September, there were thousands. So it is very difficult sometimes to get through the morass between the instant experts that you might see on Fox News or on CNN, the quality of the materials. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a presentation to explain a little bit about terrorism, the specific role that women are increasingly playing, and then sort of talk about where are we going next. So, next slide. All right, so for at least most of the people in the room, other than the high school students, you probably remember 1983 with the attack against the Marine barracks buildings as well as the French barracks in Lebanon in 1983. And so for the most part, although we have instances of terrorism going all the way back to, you know, if you want to go back to the Russian anarchists, but for the most part, when we look at terrorism, we start counting in 1968, and when we look at suicide terrorism, we tend to start counting in 1983. And suicide terrorism has really changed quite a bit over the years. Now, if you were to look at a map, you can see from 1991 till, let's say, last year, there's really been a proliferation of suicide terrorism. At the outset, from 83 until 1990, there were only 3 countries. And this wasn't something that was fairly common. There had been, you know, 1 or 2 instances in Kuwait. It had been in Sri Lanka and Lebanon, and that's it. And then, just fast forward a few years into the 90s, you have this literal explosion of suicide terrorism in many of the countries I've listed here, Israel, India, Pakistan. What you don't see the comments on the bottom is that for the most part, there's about 44 countries involved, with the groups overwhelmingly are groups that, 1, are Islamic and 2, are religiously based. Now, one of the things that's important to remember is that it's not anything specific about Islam that makes it more conducive to suicide terrorism. And one of the things that I covered in my first book was that, for the most part, every single religion you can think of has had this interplay between violence, self-sacrifice. In fact, one of the most extreme and successful suicide terrorist organizations in the world was actually the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and you know, they're not Muslim at all. Let alone the fact that in places like Lebanon, you've had Christian suicide terrorists. So it's not something that is particular to one religion. Why then would you ask, has there just been such a proliferation of these groups among Islamic organizations? And for the most part, what it is that there's been a justification within the religious circles that is not paralleled in Catholicism, and it's not paralleled in some of the other faiths. So for instance, I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland studying the Troubles and the fact that for the most part, you didn't see suicide bombers in Ireland, although they fought the British for a very long time. Why is that? For the most part, the clergy was antithetical to using suicide terrorism. They were okay with hunger strikes, but they were not okay with killing yourself and killing others in the process. And I think it's that legitimation that really differentiates the various faiths. And again, this isn't mainstream Islam. In fact, if you know anything about the Islamic faith, suicide terrorism violates Islam on 3 basic points. 1, Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is totally against suicide. 2, Islam is actually against civilian casualties. And 3, again, strict interpretation of the Quran, Islam is against killing other Muslims. And yet, if you look at what's going on a day-to-day level, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, there's a violation of all 3 of those tenets. So that it's very important that we understand that as we associate this particular tactic with a faith, because it's been legitimated and it's been discussed, and that there are a series of individuals who are not mainstream that approve it, we should realize that they're really kind of the fringe. Mainstream Islam is still not for suicide terrorism. And it is really important to know that. And again, if you have any questions, Jim didn't mention, but my degree at McGill was also in Islamic studies, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I won't be shy, and I don't think I've got the guys who are here for the imam, so, you know, make your questions nice. Next slide. All right, so as a general rule, what I did in my first book was I compared suicide terrorism across a number of different places and a lot of different religions to try to show what were the similarities and what were the differences. For the most part, and I apologize for some of the political science language, for the most part, we tend to see suicide terrorism in the second iteration of conflict. So what do I mean by that? For the most part, you're not going to see suicide terrorism in the first time that there's a war. So it wasn't, for instance, in the first World Trade Center attack. It wasn't in the first Chechen war. It wasn't in the first Intifada. You did see it in the second Chechen war. You saw it in the second Intifada. You saw it in the second attack against the World Trade Center. So what we're able to deduce is that perhaps suicide terrorism is not the first choice for organizations because, as you can imagine, it gobbles up some of their most active members, and it's very difficult to replace them. So it's not really your first choice. There's something else that might happen between the first conflict and the second conflict, or the first war and the second war. Counterterrorism strategies may have changed in such a way that people who ordinarily would not have supported violence get off the fence and start to support it. And why do I say that? We tend to see a lot of things like the use of drones and aerial bombardments and very coercive counterterrorism strategies that are used in order to protect soldiers, to protect civilians of the other side, that then tend to make people more radical, and people who ordinarily would never have joined the terrorist groups start to think twice and say, you know what, maybe they have a point. The other thing to remember, it's a rationally calculated strategy. And when we use terms in political science like rational calculation, we certainly don't mean that it's good. We know that it's terrible. But what we mean by rational is that they weigh their costs and they think about their options and the cost-benefit ratio, and they make decisions based on what they think is going to be the best for them. And that's why I'm saying it's calculated. And if they get a sense that using tactics will actually literally blow up in their face, they tend to rethink. The examples that I gave in the book were, and again, many of you may not realize this, but in 1990 in April, there were 3 car bombs that the IRA used individuals, they made them stay in the car, and they rammed these car bombs into British checkpoints, 3 on the same day in April, to try to demonstrate that they were willing to go the distance to get the Brits out of Northern Ireland. They never did it again. Why? Well, what happened was the next day, even the most staunch Republicans, and when I say Ireland and Republicans, we're not talking about Sarah Palin here. We're talking about the nationalists. The most staunch Republicans in Ireland went up to the Sinn Féin offices and they said, I can do the accent if you want. You're making us look like those fanatics in the Middle East. Don't do that. This is not what we're about. And so Sinn Féin realized very quickly, this is not a winning strategy for us, and they stopped. Now, this doesn't mean that they stopped being violent, and it doesn't mean that they stopped killing people. The Canary Wharf bombing in London killed lots of people, and there were lots of other attacks. But this particular kind of strategy didn't suit the IRA. It's very important also to remember that suicide terrorism is always used in conjunction with a host of other tactics, and so it's going to be used with regular terrorism, IEDs, roadside bombs, shootings, snipers, all these things. We have a tendency to focus on suicide terrorism, in part because we live in a very sort of media-savvy world in which the lead story is going to be the most shocking, you know, whether it's Schwarzenegger or DSK in the IMF. The fact is, our media likes to really shock, and suicide terrorism tends to be fairly shocking. And then finally, and again, this is more the unique contribution that I provided in the book, was that when you had a terrorist organization, and then you started to have multiple terrorist organizations, perhaps as a result of splinters or splits or rivals. A lot of times these groups would start to compete with one another for who was going to lead the people in the future. So one terrorist group, if there was one dominant group, they didn't necessarily use suicide terrorism. But if there were 2 or 3 or 4, there were huge incentives to outbid, to do more than the other guys. And so this is where we started with one enemy in Iraq, which was Saddam Hussein. And now there are 13 different Sunni groups and 12 different Shia groups, and these keep proliferating. So you can imagine that there are huge incentives, there are huge competitions amongst the different terrorist leaders for people's popular attention. And we're seeing it now that bin Laden is dead. We talk about Zawahiri, that he's number 2, but he's not very popular. What about al-Awlaki? He's in Yemen. He's a great guy. What about Libby? So basically, all these guys, although they may necessarily be working with Al-Qaeda, and they might, in principle, have the same ideas and goals, personally, some of them don't get along, and there's a lot of rivalry and competition. Now, in the short term, you would think that that's necessarily a good thing, because, divide and conquer. In the long term, however, when you have multiple organizations and they start to compete, Americans suffer, civilians suffer. Next slide. All right, so what I did was I just summarized for those of you who would ever be interested in suicide terrorism, specifically sort of as a general rule, that suicide terrorism tended to occur when there were other tactics that the terrorists used and they failed, but also when they're in competition for people's support or perhaps financial support. The fact that Saddam Hussein used to offer $10,000 for suicide bombers, I'm sure provided at some level an incentive, but Al-Qaeda did it as well, and there's rumors about the Iranian regime. So the fact is, when organizations get money for being the lead story in Al Jazeera, those are some of the incentives I'm talking about. However, and here's the caveat, it's only going to take root and spread when the population really accepts it. If the population rejects it, the terrorists are going to rethink their strategy. It happened with the IRA, it happened with ETA, which is the Basque terrorists in Spain and in France. They started to kill lots of civilians, and all of a sudden they realized, this isn't a good strategy for us. It's not winning us the hearts and minds. So if you can imagine, terrorist leaders are just as interested in winning hearts and minds as the guys down in Washington at the State Department. They're just approaching it in a very different way. So one of the things that I wanted to tell you about today is just a little, very, very brief history lesson that terrorism has really changed quite a bit in our lifetime. It's gone from being sort of targeted, stationary targets like embassies or military targets where they use a car bomb. But the terrorists are constantly innovating, and they're changing their tactics. They're changing who they use as an operative. And so there was an introduction starting in 1983, but in particular in 1991, the use of women. Now there's a picture here which, it's not about the Middle East, it's from the Tamil Tigers, but this particular woman wearing the orange silwar kameez and the green shawl was able to get within, a foot of Rajiv Gandhi, who was the former Prime Minister of India, and blew up her suicide bomb, killing him, herself, and about 19 others. So the LTTE, although they didn't start women suicide bombers, they certainly perfected them. And one of the things, I'll tell you a little bit, some of their strategies to make women appear as if they're in a late-term pregnancy by placing the IED around the midsection under these very loose, flowing, and traditional clothing. So again, as many previously held assumptions as we might have about women, a late-term pregnancy has even more assumptions associated with it, that, this is going to be a peaceful person. An expectant mother is not who you expect to be a bomber. And then finally, at the bottom, there's been a proliferation of the use of the internet. So for the most part, we're seeing a shift. It used to be that if you wanted to be part of Al-Qaeda, you had to be in a training camp with Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and get that training and have face-to-face time with some of these jihadis. Now they do all that on the internet. And so you've got people in America, you've got people in London, you've got people throughout Europe who are on the internet being exposed to very radical ideas and then trying to find ways into Iraq, into Afghanistan, or perhaps becoming self-starters and deciding to do something more locally at home, perhaps in Times Square. Now, we have started talking more and more about women, but for the people in the room who are older than 30, in 1968, there were lots of women involved in terrorism. I put some notorious women up on the board that many of you may remember from the 70s. So these women, let's say starting closest with the woman with the cigarette. Oh, I've got laser technology. Laser. You have here, Ulrike Meinhof was so important to the Baader-Meinhof organization that the organization, was named after her. Astrid Prohl was another member who was particularly influential. And again, if any of you are interested in ever seeing films about this, the Baader-Meinhof complex is a fantastic film, just came out last year, that gives you, sort of really explodes the myth of what being involved in terrorism really is like. And then of course, Leila Khaled from the PFLP became infamous for the multiple plane hijackings in 1970 to Zarqa base in Jordan. So for the most part, we shouldn't be surprised that women are involved in terrorism, but these women were very different kinds of women. These women tended to be ideologues, leaders, and all three of these were poster children for the organization. This was the public face, whether it was Baader-Meinhof, the Red Army faction, or the PFLP. This is now the new face of women in terrorism. It's a very different kind of face. This woman here, Samira Ahmed Jassim, was arrested a few years ago for having arranged 80 girls to be raped in Iraq to force them or to transform them to become suicide bombers for Ansar al-Sunnah. So what happened is that they were having a lull in recruitment. It was difficult to get people to join voluntarily, and so what they did was they coerced women and girls, and they ranged along in age from 15 all the way up to 60. The women would be raped, and because of the honor code in their society, there's only one route out, boom. So for the most part, this is something we have to realize. These are not women who are enthusiastically involved in terrorism. We do have instances where women are, being transformed into terrorists, sometimes against their will. Now, it's not true for every case, but in this particular instance, what we were able to see in Diyala province, where Samira Ahmed Jassim was active, was the number of suicide bombers, women bombers, went up 800% because of this lady. So what we're seeing is that women can still be involved in all levels of the organization, and they're especially useful as propagandists. Part of what they're able to do on the internet is they're able to say to a male Muslim population, you're not manly. If you were manly, you'd step up and go and be a jihadi. And they use these gender norms in their society to get men to feel less manly unless they do something. But the other thing that we're seeing is that the women are hardly ever leaders or ideologues now. Much more often do we see women as cannon fodder. Now, with bin Laden's death, and there's been a younger generation, obviously, again, unless Zawahiri takes over, the younger generation has always been a lot more enthusiastic about the use of women. So although you had Ayman al-Zawahiri saying there's no women in al-Qaeda, in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2005 were using women. And same thing was true of al-Awlaki, and the same thing is true of Omar Hamami, who is the famous Alabaman jihad, who is in Somalia. So that these younger generations of al-Qaeda, the next generation of leaders, have a very different outlook on what roles women can play and whether women can be frontline activists. But here's where it gets interesting. Zawahiri decided he's going to play both sides of this fence even before bin Laden was killed. So on the one hand, Ayman al-Zawahiri releases a statement to say there's no women in al-Qaeda. But Mrs. Zawahiri releases a letter and says, but women can be a part of it and can be suicide bombers. And so you're not going to convince me that Mr. Zawahiri doesn't know what Mrs. Zawahiri is saying. So I think what it is it allows him to talk to a very conservative membership and still be staunch against the idea of women as jihadis or women being involved in front line. And at the same time, his wife gets to speak to a younger generation of women who are really interested in being part of the jihad. And it gets very, very interesting as you're looking through these websites to watch the debate ebb and flow. Regardless of where you decide who is in charge, there is definitely an increasing role of women throughout all of these organizations. Now, one of the more famous groups that have used women is the Riyadus Sahlin. This is the Chechen group that have been involved in the attacks against the Moscow subway. If you remember March 29th of last year, well, not this past March 29th, but a year ago, March 29th, they attacked the Moscow subway station at 2 stations. There were 2 different bombers, and the 2 women could not have been more different. Janet Abdurrahmanova was a 15-year-old bride of a jihadi who blew up after her husband had been killed, sort of the stereotype that we associate with why women participate in the jihad. However, her cohort, Mariam Sharapova, had a master's degree in mathematics and computer science and was the headmistress at a school. So you couldn't have more diverse women involved in the Chechen jihad, and yet we still assume that there's some sort of profile. With the religious women, what was happening is that the Chechen women became involved, and a lot of the Islamic women in places like Israel and Palestine and around the world began to lobby for, and I'm using air quotes, but for their rights to become suicide bombers. And there are lots of stories where the head of Hamas actually said to women, we don't need you, we have more than enough men, and they would send the women away. Why don't you go blow up for a different organization? I hear the PFLP is taking women, you can go blow up for them, and Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, you can go down the street, you can go sign up with them. And that actually initially happened. But the amount of pressure that both Sheikh Yassin and Sheikh Rantisi began to feel from within the Palestinian female community convinced them, maybe we should rethink our proposition. This is what I was talking about, the adaptive nature of the terrorist organizations. But also, it became increasingly more difficult for men to get through Israeli checkpoints. And the Israelis weren't expecting women. And so they got 3 religious women to get involved. And in fact, the last one, over here, Reem Riashi, was a mother of 2, and in many of the videos and photos posed with the kids. So again, it completely exploded many of the myths that we had about why women participate. Now here's where some of the debates that I mentioned earlier become relevant. Now in 2003, the FBI issues a warrant for the arrest of an MIT engineer named Afia Siddiquis, who recently resurfaced, and there have been allegations that perhaps she's been tortured for the last few years. These allegations are being made by her sister. Al-Qaeda started to make a few statements about women's units, all the while with bin Laden saying we don't need women, Zawahiri saying we don't need women. However, in 2004, they launched this cute little pink website called Al-Khansa'a, and what it was like a web-based magazine for female, wives of jihadis. I called it was the Women's Wear Daily for the jihadis. It, had a little bit of everything about the hijabs. It had a few recipes. It had some suggestions, while your man's on jihad, don't blow all the cash at the bank. Make sure you pay the bills, take care of the household. In other words, it had a lot of advice for the ladies. However, we get this gentleman here, Sheikh Kadarawi, who is the sort of the televangelical imam equivalent in the Islamic world. He has a huge following out of UAE. And he begins to say, if we look at the Quran very carefully, a woman's obligation for jihad is the same as a man's. And in fact, we should have more women on jihad. And women began to look at Kadarawi as being very advanced. And you have, increasingly, he now has a following. I call him the Jerry Falwell of the jihadi sect, that he's got lots of people who log onto his website, they listen to his sermons, and he has now become one of the key voices leading the charge that not only should women be involved, but children too. Because if it's a defensive jihad, everyone gets involved. You also started to see all the various groups, Israel, Palestine, Chechnya, Uzbekistan, even in Pakistan, women began to be involved in the organizations, even as bombers. And just 3 weeks ago, Al-Qaeda released this. This is called AlShamika. What it does is it has a few pieces of advice for the ladies. We think you should marry a jihadi, and you should raise your children in such a way that we ensure the next generation of jihad, that the jihad doesn't die out with one man. How could they have known? That the jihad doesn't die with one individual, and that it continues. But it also had a few, again, like the women's wear daily for previous, and this is why you should wear a hijab. You don't want to get wrinkles. You want to protect your complexion. They even had a few recipes for, facial masks and, different things to advise the ladies. And again, the use of pink and purple. This was dubbed in the Western press as the Jihadi Cosmo. And this is, again, just March of this year. So although, we have no clear frame of reference that Ayman al-Zawahiri, as the next leader of Al-Qaeda, is going to say yes, women, we have a few indications. His wife is saying yes, women. They're sponsoring websites. They're distributing magazines. They're putting things on the internet. So it is looking increasingly like, as it becomes more difficult for men to conduct operations, because again, till this day, the TSA and all the security officials are still looking for a bearded man, this is where women become particularly a stealth weapon. Now, why do organizations want to use women? I think some of this is pretty intuitive. The easiest way is to avoid detection. And of course, the women and children are better at accessing civilian targets. So if you're trying to kill women and children, use an operative that looks like your target. It's all about blending in, like being a chameleon. When I conducted my field research in Sri Lanka and I spent some time with the leaders of the LTTE, one of the things that they said to me is they felt that the women were more easily manipulated and that they were more expendable. I always make sure I tell audiences that the terrorist leaders said, so you don't think that I think women are more expendable, but they really did think so. And here's the thing, when it's a woman, they get 8 times more press than a man. Here's the example I would give you. When there was that attack against the metro in Moscow on March 29th of 2010, tons of reports. I bet most of you guys caught something on CNN, bless you, caught something on CNN or in USA Today or in the New York Times that you heard about that. You probably didn't hear that there were 3 more attacks later that week, perpetrated by men. So this is where, when it's a woman, automatically you start getting a lot more focus and attention because the newspapers and the reporters are trying to figure out what's going on. The organizations are well aware of the media effect, and so what they tend to do is they tend to select more attractive bombers. Now, these ladies may not be your cup of tea. However, in their communities, these are hot chicks. This is, housewives of not Orange County, of the Jihad County. But here you have Hanadi Jaradat. Again, this is a woman who was finishing a law degree, very attractive, very desirable in her community. And then Wafa Dreis, who's considered the first Palestinian female suicide bomber. Sana Mahdali, who's the very first female bomber in Lebanon. I'm forgetting her name. Is it Nadia? Is it down there? Sorry. It was a Christian woman. I'm forgetting her name. And for the most part, what you've got is, if you could shrink it up on the little thing, you see where it says view? Excuse me for the technical difficulty. Norma, not Nadia. Norma. So Norma Abi Hassan, here with the red beret, was actually a Christian bomber in Lebanon. And then Ahlama Tamimi, till this day, is most famous for having helped perpetrate the attack against the Sabara pizzeria bombing in Jerusalem. She's now since been elected as part of the Hamas ticket. And so she's become very famous in Hamas circles. She's in a jail, so she's not actually one of the bombers. But again, as I started with, not every single female bomber is attractive, but the organizations are aware of the media effect, and having the opportunity to select among a number of people will select on certain criteria. Attractiveness for the women is one of them. University education is another, because a Saudi who's gone to university probably speaks English, and a Palestinian who's gone to university probably speaks Hebrew. That is a very good skill set to have as you're trying to get to your target. All right, so here we have, this that I mentioned before was the very first bomber in Sri Lanka, who was a woman who managed to kill Rajiv Gandhi. What she was able to do was she got physically very close to him and knelt down at his feet to give him the strand of flowers. What the Sri Lankans pioneered then, the Tamils pioneered in Sri Lanka, was the use of an IED that fit around the midsection so that you would be able to give the appearance of pregnancy if they were wearing traditional clothes. Next slide. And here, actually, in 2006, a woman who was trying to kill General Sarah Fonseca managed to access the military base where he was at because 1 week or 1 weekend in the month, the medical team allowed people from the community to come in and get some treatment. So she visited the medical treatment center at the military base for 7 or 8 weeks prior to trying to kill Fonseca. Now, Noja wasn't successful, and in fact, the Sri Lankan government tried to disseminate the allegation she was really pregnant, which she wasn't. But you can see that all the assumptions that we have about the inherent peacefulness of women become salient here. And this is how clever they were. They knew that Fonseca wasn't going to be at the base until April. So she started visiting the clinic in February. So again, long-term planning, very rationally calculated. And they use their wiles and whatever they have at their disposal to have a successful operation. Now, according to Lieutenant Commander David Russell, he says, till this day, female suicide bombers have become the weapon of choice for al-Qaeda in Iraq because women are less likely to be searched at checkpoints and wear long black Islamic robes that can conceal the explosives. And this is where we've had a number of women in Iraq, in the range of about 63 different women have blown up in Iraq, all of whom have used this ruse to give the appearance of late-term pregnancy or to, conceal the bomb in a very clever way. So I gave you some of the reasons why the organizations use women. Why would women want to join? Well, in order to just give a summary, I created this 4 hours plus 1. For the most part, women are looking to redeem perhaps something in their past. And this was true of a lot of the early female bombers who felt that they had something in their past for which they were very embarrassed. So among the Palestinian bombers, one woman was unable to have a child, one woman had an extramarital affair, one woman had a child out of wedlock, one woman's father was accused of working too closely with the Israelis and being a collaborator. With that one act, they're able to completely wipe the slate clean. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch. They completely transform themselves of being a harlot or being the one who couldn't have a baby to now being a martyr. And it's a completely different title for these women to have. But there's also the notion of revenge. A lot of the women who are involved in suicide terrorism and in terrorism in general very often verbally will say that they're avenging the loss of a brother or a father or a husband or a loved one. So there's a very personal nature to the attack. There's this issue of respect, and I think that this explains why some of the Hamas women were so aggressive with Rantisi and Yassin, the former leaders of Hamas that were target assassinated by the Israelis, that they wanted to participate because they wanted to show that they were just as dedicated to the cause as men. And the notion of relationship is very important. And the reason I say that is the best predictor of a woman's involvement in terrorism is being related to a man who's involved in terrorism. Among all the women for my current book that just came out a few weeks ago that I interviewed, Overwhelmingly, every single woman I spoke to had, when she was involved, a brother, a father, a grandfather involved in the organization, and that it did two things. It wasn't just that she was doing it as part of, the family business, but also it was a way that the organization could vet a new recruit. They didn't have to worry about the daughter or the sister of a current member because the likelihood of her being a plant by the security forces was quite low. And so this is, again, there's a lot of reasons why you see sisters, daughters, mothers getting involved. And then finally since we were originally hoping to talk about rape, there is this notion that if the forces of occupation, whether it's in Sri Lanka or whether it's Americans in Iraq, are raping women, they automatically are going to join the organization, and the terrorist group will be the only one that embraces women and says, you're welcome here. You can blow up for us. Because for them, for many of these women in these very conservative patriarchal societies, being raped is a death sentence. And it's a death sentence by members of their own family. There's one other thing in terms of the notion of respect. These women become more famous in their deaths than they could ever be alive. The example I gave you here is of Wafa Dreis, who in 2002, on January 27th, blew up for the organization called Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. There are still to this day questions whether she was intending to blow up or whether she got caught in a revolving door because she had the bomb in a backpack rather than on her person. And at that point, Palestinians had never used a woman. So we still don't know 100%. But what happened was there were novelettes written, published all about her life. She became famous. There were streets and parks named after her. And in fact, they even named a Girl Scout, different kind of Girl Scouts they have here than there. They named a Girl Scout camp for training martyrs and, future active terrorists after her. So what she was able to achieve in her death was unparalleled. She would never have been able to do that alive. And in fact, one of the other women, a 15-year-old Iraqi girl named Renay Mutleg, always grew up saying, I want to grow up and be a doctor. And her family said, well, that's not likely, but you can be a bomber. And so she's one of the bombers that was preempted in Iraq. Little girls throughout Palestine and little girls throughout the Tamil areas, regardless of where I was traveling, they want to grow up and be like Wafa Dreis or like Danu. In other words, they don't put pictures of, oh, you guys are going to have to help me. What's the female equivalent? Well, they don't put Lady Gaga up on their walls. Is that now? Is Lady Gaga current? Okay, I don't want to fall into the generation gap. They don't put up pictures of Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga on their walls. The kids put up pictures of famous bombers. And it becomes a culture of martyrdom where every piece of information that these young people have is that the only good thing you can do in your life is to be a martyr. And it's really a very insidious message that's being sent to a whole new generation, because although we'd like to think that you can get rid of terrorism by killing one man in the eye, the fact is Rantisi and Yassin were killed years ago and Hamas still exists. And so it's not necessarily the case that by killing the leader of a group, that group goes away forever. And especially when the whole youth have been primed to become bombers as they get older, we have a real problem that we face for the future. This is a picture here. I mentioned Renay Mutleg, the 15-year-old girl. What happened was her family decided that no, she was more likely going to do great things with her life by being a bomber. They married her off to a jihadi, which in this instance, right away you know what's going to happen to her. And she was caught by the Iraqi police and they managed to defuse the bomb. She was on her way to a school of Shia children to blow it up. Because what's happened is that suicide terrorism in Iraq and in Pakistan and in Afghanistan has become much more part of the sectarian violence than against Americans and British and NATO forces. However, there is an aspect that we can't ignore, that is, for as long as American troops are in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is this very unhappy dynamic between the presence of male soldiers and the women on the ground. Now, what happens is during periods of occupation, I'm doing a study now for the Office of Naval Research, where we're looking not just at the American occupation, but at all occupations, that routinely women get targeted. And for those of you who missed the story in CNN today, even in Libya, it becomes part and parcel of coercion against the population to target the women in these ways. So whether they're being targeted by the government or by military forces, foreigners that are present, this has a way of radicalizing the population. It has a double effect, not just of radicalizing the women into terrorism, but also radicalizing the men in their lives. Scenes like this from Abu Ghraib, let's go fast on that one because we've got young people here, as well as the attack against Abeer Junabi. Abeer Junabi was the 14-year-old girl in Mahmoudiya who was basically stalked, raped, killed. Her family was killed. They burnt the bodies to try to, cover up the crime. What happened was a very shocking instance where, of course, these guys were court-martialed, and Colonel Green over here was pursued because he was no longer in the military in a civilian case and found guilty. But this one instance was blown up in terms of propaganda throughout the Arab world. This was the biggest story in 2006. Throughout, every newspaper from the Gulf all the way to North Africa. And, I put up here just to give you an example that the Islamic Revival Organization, which is one of the suicide groups, said, they violate the honor of Muslims in their houses, raping them, and following up their horrible crime by burning the bodies to conceal it from people as if the crimes of the oppressors, which the glorious Quran has warned us about, and so on and so forth. In other words, they take the one bad apple and they will say to the whole population, that's what Americans are doing here. For Abeer Junabi, they really promoted this innocent young girl and talked about her in every news source. There were websites attributed to the 14-year-old. Al-Qaeda posted revenge videos. And in fact, a suicide bomber brigade was created, named after her, and they named several missiles that they were firing at the Americans, the Abeer. The other thing that happens when you have the presence of these foreign troops and the possibility that there's inappropriate conduct vis-a-vis the women is it really hits the internet here in this country. I have examples here of Jihad Jane and Jihad Jamie, as well as on the far right here. This is Malika Al-Arud, who is one of the most important jihadis in Europe. And so these women are on the internet posting videos, getting people to sign up, getting people to go to Iraq and kill Americans. And the reason, go to the next one. And the reason that it's important is what happens here impacts the rest of the globe directly. Now, when they use men, it's not nearly as effective. I put this up here. This is my Austin Powers slide called That's a Man, Baby. In 2007, the Iraqi police stopped a car in which there was a bride and a groom and two members of the wedding party. People don't elope in Iraq, and they don't have 4 people at the wedding. And, the security forces looked in, and they saw here Haider al-Bahdal, and they thought, that is the ugliest woman I've ever seen. And they took the veil off, and Haider hadn't shaved for 4 days. So it became fairly obvious that it was a man. And so the fact remains that when the jihadis try to use men pretending to be women, it's not nearly as effective as when they actually use women. Last slide. So what I'm going to end with, where are we going in the future? I touched upon earlier in this talk that there is these cultures of martyrdom that are being created in which the children are primed for nothing more in their lives than to become martyrs. There are debates now within the Islamic circles about justifying children's participation as jihadis. And in fact, if you read the news in Pakistan, there are tons of 14 and 12 and even as young as 6-year-old boys in Afghanistan being used as suicide bombers. Now, the fact is, this is something to be concerned about, not just because it's horrific, but also because it parlays into the idea that terrorism is multi-generational. I'm sure the black and tans who left Ireland in 1917 thought, this won't last long. And in 1926, when they created the the Republic of Ireland from 1926, 1932. Oh, this is not going to last long. And yes, and I guess this morning there was a bomb found to try to kill the Queen. So the fact is, when terrorism is multi-generational, in some of these conflicts, it becomes a concern not just for now, but for the future. And when they are actively pursuing child operatives and creating cultures of martyrdom, it's something for us to be aware of because we need to find ways to fight it. I'm going to stop here and allow for questions. What we've seen, although the rape of Nanjing in 1936 and what has happened in Bangladesh in 1971, it's not new that women are targeted. And in fact, you could go all the way back to the Bible, or early Rome, the rape of the Sabines, or the laws that are promulgated about the Ammonite women. The fact that women are particularly vulnerable at times of war comes as no surprise to anyone in the room. I think what's happened since the Bosnian War in the 1990s, we've seen a slight shift. We've seen the idea that rape isn't just about sort of the immediate sexual gratification of the soldier, but it's part of a long-term plan that is intended to change the demographics of that community. And so what we've seen time and time again is the deliberate and systematic use of rape as a tool of war. Now, it's also a tool of punishment, and it happens in wars in which there are no significant ethnic differences. I'd say the Libya case is a very good one. But we also have to understand that there's different kinds of rape. There's almost like 6 different kinds of rape. There's the rape for the ethnic purposes where you're trying to deliberately impregnate the women and change the demographics of the future generations. But there's also the rapes that occur as punishment for participating or not participating in a political movement, or assuming that the women themselves don't have information, but if they're raped in front of their men, the men will give up the information. So we have lots of different, we think about rape as an umbrella term, when in fact, in reality, there are very different rapes depending on what countries and what wars we're looking at. But the fact is that it's been on the increase in places like Sierra Leone and in Darfur, not just the more obvious cases that we hear about, like in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo. So it's something that has been largely left off of the agenda that we study in, let's say, international politics, in part because on the one hand, the feminist scholars will tell you, well, yes, of course men rape, that's what they do. And in fact, the weapons of war are shaped like penises, so there's no surprise there. And then the realists, the hardcore bombs and bullets guys say, well, that's a part of war. And so you have this very strange bedfellow situation where the very left-wing feminists and the very right-wing hawks come to the conclusion that it's not worth sort of scratching beyond the surface to understand what dynamics are at play. But for me personally, for let's say the Amarska rape camp that was in Serbia, to keep women, to rape them until they get pregnant and keep them until they're past their second trimester so that they can't abort, basically you're giving resources to keep them alive. That to me is very, very different from just going around and killing women or going and raping women because they're available.
Question right here.
Very nice presentation. My question is, do you have suggestions of how to prevent, eliminate, or discourage terrorism?
Oh, well, yeah, of course I have the answer, but we talk about, demobilizing people, and here's where it gets complicated. The United States government has spent millions of dollars assuming that you can de-radicalize people. There are programs that the United States has helped fund in Morocco and Saudi Arabia, the Yemen Committee on Dialogue in Jordan. There are comparable programs in Colombia for DDR, which is demobilization of former fighters for the FARC. Problem is that when you look at the programs, there's no metric to measure whether people change their ideas or just change their behavior. And the reason why this is important is we have metrics for people who commit child abuse, whether they're likely to engage in recidivism. We have, a test, a DSM-sponsored test for people if they're likely to murder or kill again. We don't have a test, we don't have any metric to ascertain if someone has been a terrorist, are they going to be a terrorist again in the future? And the reason it's important is as we're looking at closing Guantanamo or releasing people either from Guantanamo or Bagram or Abu Ghraib, the fact is we have this constant worry that what they're just going to do is come back and become terrorists again. So there's, first of all, one of the early things that we need to disaggregate is, what does it mean to be de-radicalized, if that's even possible? Or is maybe the goal less about changing how people feel about the world and more about what they do? Maybe it's just good enough that they don't kill people. So that's the first thing. As far as preventing terrorism, I mean, there's some things that we can do. Part of it is what I tried to show you in the presentation. The terrorist leaders are pretty much going to respond to what the street or what people say. And I think that if we make terrorism less attractive for people, the leaders and the members of the organizations, these people who are 100% committed, you're not going to change their minds. But you can change the environment. And by changing the environment, that's, I think, where we have a little bit of an entree with hearts and minds. And this is where it becomes, you know, it's a tough sell. To an American population facing this kind of economic challenges that we face, to say that we need to invest and have a Marshall Plan for Iraq and a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan isn't going to resonate as well as it did after World War II when Marshall Plans were proposed for Japan and Germany. So we need to do better. And I think that we are starting to see some glimmers of hope. The Arab Spring that happened in Syria, well, happening in Syria, but in Egypt and in Tunisia, and sort of spreading throughout the Arab world, had nothing to do with bin Laden. There was not one photo of bin Laden that was put on a poster. And I think that in some ways, if we can, you know, help these grassroots movements, and I'm not saying impose democracy from above, but I'm talking about helping the civil society emerge throughout the Arab world, they are more likely to reject the terrorist leaders because they see that that's not the only route out of their, you know, continued unhappiness. So I think we're walking a very tight line. I would say that, you know, we still don't know what's going to happen with Al-Qaeda. And the fact that there are a lot of potential rivals to take over for bin Laden, but there are things that we can continue to do. And, you know, helping civilians in Libya is actually a good thing, as well as helping promote education in the Arab world and providing skill sets beyond shooting a gun or blowing yourself up. So I think people will often resort to terrorism when there's these feelings of hopelessness. And I think providing hope, whether it's kind of an Obama-style hope that this country experienced during the election, or a different kind of hope, might be one of the first steps that we take.
Thank you. Next question.
That was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
Some groups mentally impaired young people use suicide bombers. Is that true for young women or?
That's an excellent question. I wasn't sure if you could hear. Are mentally impaired people specifically targeted? What happened is that there were 2 women that blew up in the Baghdad bird market that were allegedly women who suffered from Down syndrome. What happened, in fact, after the investigation occurred, the women didn't have Down syndrome. And in fact, as you can imagine, I've talked about how the terrorist organizations are very strategic and they want to use operatives that blend in with a crowd. 2 women with Down syndrome would stand out here. It would really stand out in the Middle East. What happens is, and I apologize for the younger people in the audience, when there's a bomb, it changes the physiognomy of your face, and it may have this effect. As the head blows off, it changes how the head looks. So that being the case, that's why the first initial newspaper report said that. However, these women were under the care of a psychiatrist, and it turned out that the psychiatrist was the recruiter. Now, there was one case in Israel of a 14 or 15-year-old boy who was mentally handicapped, who was manipulated. But again, what happens is when terrorist leaders use, and I'll use the word inappropriate operatives, inappropriate according to even a Salafi interpretation of what martyrdom is, there's a lot of backlash. The best story I can give you is In 2006, the Taliban tried to trick a 6-year-old boy into becoming a suicide bomber. They put an IED, an improvised explosive device, on the 6-year-old kid, and they said, go up to some soldiers and press this plunger, and when you do, there's going to be flowers, and it's going to be really nice, and you'll smell sweet perfume, and there'll be food that appears. Now, the 6-year-old kid from the village thought to himself, this isn't kosher. Well, okay, maybe he didn't think this isn't kosher. He said, this isn't right. And he went up to the ANA soldiers, and he said, these men put something on me. And he showed them, he didn't press the plunger, and they took it off of it. Now, when the Pashtun Vali of his village, the older gentlemen who are in charge of everything, when they found out that they had tried to trick a 6-year-old illiterate child into becoming a suicide bomber, this village, which had never cooperated with the Americans, began to cooperate against the Taliban. So I think that there is a real challenge that if the terrorist organizations use people who are completely inappropriate, and the idea of the martyr in Islam is the equivalent in your Old Testament, if you remember, when Moses was told to bring a sacrifice, you brought the fatted calf. You didn't bring the animal with the broken leg that had, some sort of skin disease. That's not a proper sacrifice for God. By that same token, when you provide a martyr to Allah, you don't provide someone who's defective. And here's the most important thing to think about. People who are, let's say, not well balanced, people who might have other handicaps, are more likely to make mistakes. And as a terrorist leader, you want an operative who's going to be able to carry through a mission, not get caught, and not make a mistake. So chances are you're not going to use somebody who's crazy, or you're not going to use, aggressively crazy, and you're not going to use anyone who has a particular handicap that might impair their mission.
I don't think our microphone's working, so I'm going to have our person here ask a question, and then I'll try to get to the other side.
Is there any correlation between the level of industrialization and the economic stability of a country with the exploitation of the woman or how often they're used? Is there any, are more industrialized countries less likely to use women, or is there any correlation there?
I mean, Leah asked the question about a relationship between industrialization and, let's say, GNP and level of the terrorist exploitation of women. Part of the issue is that, for the most part, you don't have very technologically developed countries that have terrorism unless they're the target of terrorism. But if we look at places, let's say, Saudi Arabia compared to, the Gaza Strip is considerably more developed, and yet there are a lot of Saudis who join these organizations, not just the 19 on 9/11. So in terms of GNP and economic development, there really isn't a strong link. And in fact, the president, one of the people on the president's cabinet, was a professor, a colleague of mine named Alan Kruger who used to be a professor at Princeton. Now he works for the president. And he has some really interesting work where he shows that when you look at bombers, they tend to have a much higher GNP than their average and a much better level of education than the average of their community. And so by just focusing in on the actual operative, all of our assumptions about poverty and terrorism fly out the window. But if you look at the communities from which they come, then, excluding the 9/11 bombers and the people coming from Saudi Arabia, then maybe you have something about levels of poverty, or at least levels of inequality between the majority and the minority. When I was in Sri Lanka, looking at the way that the Tamils lived versus how the Sinhalese lived, you could definitely start to see where there was issues of poverty. When you look at Catholics in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s versus the Protestants in terms of access to housing, jobs, education, you do start to understand that there is a dynamic, not of the actual operative, because, if I'm a terrorist leader and I have 20 people who are willing to be an operative, I'm not going to select the poor illiterate one. I'm going to select the one with the university education. So part of the problem is that when we're looking at these correlations, focusing on just the operative, and that's the one you see, versus a whole organization maybe under the surface that you don't see, skews some of the data. That said, I think that when women have multiple avenues to enter into the workforce or to make serious contributions, they're probably less likely to be interested in, becoming a suicide bomber. I think that when we have lots of cases in which women have no hope in their lives for, doing anything great, making a difference, that might be where they start to think becoming a bomber, becoming a martyr is what they can do for their family and their people. But that's not significantly different than what some of the young men think as well. The gentleman asked if there's a debate within the Islamic world, because the vast majority of people don't support terrorism, to sort of challenge these fringe elements. I would say that the Arab Spring is a very good example of that. I would also say that there's two ways to answer it. There's one thing, even within, let's take the Palestinian community. A woman has a child who becomes a suicide bomber. Whether he's preempted or whether he's successful, the whole community is going to start congratulating that woman. Now, she's in a very unfortunate position. She's just lost her child. She can't voice anything negative because now the community is looking to that young man as, an ideal and a source of emulation. So there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, peer pressure to conform, because if within that society, being a martyr is the best thing you can do, it's very difficult for the individual to reject it. At the same time, one of the ways that the Israelis, you guys may or may not know, statistically, the Israelis have been able to preempt. It's not that there haven't been a lot of attempts in Israel. Very few have gotten through. One of the reasons that these attempts have been so successful is that the Israelis created like an Amber Alert equivalent. If your kid is missing, call the number, and they get right away, they get the person's name, they get a picture, they know the kid's been missing for 3 days, and this is pro forma, as part of a suicide bombing, the martyrdom, the rituals right before the attack. You separate the individual from their family because you don't want them to change their mind at the last minute. Seeing their mother is going to be guaranteed, going to give them pause. Right? Seeing his little sister or seeing his friends. And you saw that, if you ever watched the movie Paradise Now, you saw that in the film play out, that, that last minute changing their mind because they weren't segregated. Now, what happens in those 3 days is they separate them. They go through, in some of the Islamic groups, they go through intense indoctrination, praying, fasting. They have to give up smoking. They have to do all these things so that their focus is completely just the one thing. Gonna go to my target, gonna blow up. Not gonna change my mind. So I think that having this anonymous tip line has allowed the Israelis to preempt a lot of this. And I think that's one of the things. But I think the last thing that we have to take into account is we have an unfortunate relationship with the Arab world, I think because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, things like the Park 51 mosque debate, as well as allegations that the president is a Muslim, and the fact that in terms of partisan politics in this country, there has been an increase exponentially of Islamophobia. I think the problem is any mullah or any religious leader that, let's say, starts to say nice things about the United States and starts to say bad things about the jihadis, right away is going to be branded a traitor and is going to be a target. And so part of the problem is it's the silent majority that is the majority, but I think there aren't that many people who are willing to come forward, because if they do, they really are putting their lives on the line. So, I don't know what the solution is to that. I think things like the Arab Spring will allow a whole new generation of leaders to come forward that have nothing to do with jihadis, nothing to do with the Salafi ideology, and I think that that's a really good new source of emulation for the rest of the Arab world.
We have just one last question for the evening up front.
Do you consult with the TSA or the FBI or any of those our government organizations?
So we are an academic institution at Penn State, so it's the International Center for the Study of Terrorism, and so what we're about is a scientific study of terrorism. We also engage in things like field research, so I go into the field and I interview people The director of our center, John Horgan, is sort of the premier psychologist for terrorism in the world. He is on the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, made famous in Criminal Minds, but they don't have the plane. So he's on the BAU Advisory Council. So John Horgan does much more in terms of direct advising that way. But, you know, whenever we're called into Washington, whether it's a presentation to the State Department, I gave a presentation to Secretary of State Clinton's office earlier this year on the issue of women and girls, about the relationship between terrorism and rape, and how rape is being used as a source of mobilizing and recruiting women. Everything from that to just, you know, audiences such as yourself. I mean, one of the things that we have as a responsibility is, you know, my students, they get me all the time. But there's a responsibility we have as academics to make what we do understandable and digestible for just everybody. And you may not necessarily like what I have to say, and you may not necessarily agree with it, but at least I've exposed you to a different viewpoint and hopefully provided you some interesting information and maybe a handful of funny anecdotes. But the fact remains that, you know, we see ourselves not as a think tank and not as a sort of, academics for hire, but we're more about maybe being public intellectuals to make sure that what we do, which we think is very important, gets into the mainstream, because it's very easy, depending on what news you're watching, to get a very skewed perspective on this. And so I think it's also important to talk to people who spent their life studying it, rather than, you know, somebody who goes up on, you know, Hannity or Cup of Joe, or I forget, Scarborough Country, and just spouts, because they're being paid. I mean, we have people, colleagues, Evan Coleman, Jared Brackman, a whole line of pseudo-experts who don't speak a word of Arabic and have never been to these countries and have never interviewed a terrorist. And, you know, they're saying things because sometimes they're being paid a lot of money to say them. So I think it's important that as academics, we try to give you a little bit more of an objective reality. And I really do appreciate the generosity of your time that you've given me to come here tonight.